Okay, maybe we should get started.
Okay.
Further delays. So hello everyone, once again. I'm happy to meet you here virtually. Unfortunately, we couldn't meet in person as we usually do in St. Petersburg. Well, you don't miss much. It's the coronavirus and the rains, and so we're all good. It would be, of course, much better to see you all in person. Yeah. So I hope your sessions went as great as the one I happened to be in. And now we are in for our first virtual plenary keynote discussion of the NetGlow conference. A minor technical remark, so please keep your microphones muted for the sound for the sake of sound quality. And if you want to ask a question, then you unmute your microphone and speak up. There is also an option of virtually raising your hand in Zoom. If you want, you can also use that one. But I think we can also just unmute and speak out. Hopefully, we don't interrupt each other in the process, because there are quite a few people in the room now. More than 20 for sure. Maybe some other people will join later. So, yeah. And then I guess, yeah, let's move on. So let me introduce to you somebody who doesn't probably need an introduction. David Krackhardt, Professor of Organizations in Carnegie Mellon University. And well, he's been, I guess, at all major business schools of the world by now. And on the boards of several huge journals like the Academy of Management Journal or Social Network Journal, and many others. And famous for pioneering quite a few things in social network analysis. Of course, the cognitive social structure thing is the social networks as perceived and cognized by individuals. And also some technical stuff like the EI index, for instance, which is present, I think, in USANet and several others network analysis programs, which you may be familiar with. And of course, most famous for the studies on the relations and comparisons of the Philos ties, and friendship ties with history, and the Simmelian ties. And probably the talk that, not probably, the talk that we, that hopefully all of us have watched by today was focused mainly on this issue of comparison between the direct dyadic ties and the Simmelian ties, which involved a third person that both of the persons in the dyad are connected to. So without further delay, I'd like to give floor to David for just a few, to highlight the few main points he would like to about his talk, and then proceed directly into questions and answers session. So,
okay. Thank you, Nikita. Thank you. Well, it's great to be here, if only virtually. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity. When Nikita invited me, I was very excited. I had never been to NetGlow before, but it was a great opportunity, and hopefully I'll get to go sometime in the future in a more present sense. But what I thought I would talk about in the context of this conference is the extent to which these local ties that happen around our ties actually make a difference. And my particular theme about that is it comes from Simmelian ties. And I say right off the bat that the reason I got into this Simmelian tie business was I was reading Ron Burt's work on structural holes, which kept referencing Simmel. Now, Simmel was not part of my graduate school education. I was an organizational psychologist, and Simmel was a sociologist who had been dead for a long time by the time I was in there. And so when I went back to better understand structural holes, I read a paper by Simmel that said dyads versus triads, and in which he made, I thought, a wonderfully cogent argument that we should not be looking at relationships, that the relationships are not the fundamental unit of social interaction, that dyadic ties, absent the context, don't give us enough information to really tell us what's going on. And what was interesting to me about that was that what Ron took away from that article, because he references it a lot, was the Tertius Gaudens argument, where one person is in between two other players, and that is a triple, and that's certainly an important feature so that one person becomes a broker. But what Ron totally has not paid attention to is another incredibly important principle that I thought Simmel was bringing out here, and that is when you have a closed triple, all of a sudden the relationships that occur within that triple change character. They change not only strength, but they change their nature. The power of the group becomes dominant over each of the individual ties, and that doesn't happen before you have a closed triple. So I started exploring that idea, and I've been doing so for now 20 years, and have found some very interesting things, some of which I talked about in my talk. But basically, what I found is that in any network, any digraph, any relation where there are ties and there are directed ties and some of them are not directed, or any mix, any relationship can be decomposed into the set of ties that are strictly asymmetric, the set of ties that are strictly symmetric but not embedded in a triad, and all those ties that are actually embedded in a closed triple. You take the union of those sets of ties and you come up with the entire graph. More importantly, when you decompose your network, any network, into those three subgraphs, each one of them will tell you a very different story of what's going on. The asymmetric graph ties will tell you a story about the hierarchy to the extent that it exists in the system, in the organization. The soul symmetric ties tend to tell you, they tell you the least, it turns out, but the soul symmetric ties can tell you places where there are strong and somewhat bridging ties, so that you get some of the advantages of being both a strong, perhaps an innovative tie, because it's not embedded in that triple. But then when you look at those Simmelian ties, just that subset of ties, I have found wonderful insights into what's really going on in the organization. And that's the big learning for me, that in fact, our experience has told us, lots of students and different people exploring this, that when you look at the Simmelian ties, those ties that are embedded in a triple, and look at them solely as a subgraph, that so much more is revealed about what's really going on. They provide a strength in the story, a backbone to the story that is not available to you when you combine all the three types of networks together in your raw graph. In a sense, it's as if the Simmelian ties are giving you the real backbone of the story, and everything else is sort of ephemeral noise. It's ephemeral, doesn't last as long, and it's noisy, it's not as stable, it doesn't tell you as clear a story. as the underlying Simmelian ties. So a lot of what, and this I focused on a little bit in the talk, but a lot of what I've uncovered over the years is that a lot of our understanding of how networks operate in systems really can be attributed to those Simmelian ties, more so than what we usually attribute to, you know, like a strong relationship or even a symmetric relationship or reciprocation. It's not reciprocation, it's the fact that it's embedded that makes the behavior as predictable as we often find it to be. So that's the major theme. One of the criticisms I've had, not criticisms, that's not right. But one of the observations people have had, or remarks that people have had, is that really Simmelian ties are just stronger ties. They're just a way of ascertaining the strong ties in the system. And so in part my talk was to try to suggest that that's not true. You can measure the strength of tie independently of whether it's embedded. And what I have found fairly consistently is it is true that Simmelian ties are stronger than your average non-Simmelian tie, but you can have a really, really strong tie that will not tell you as much as a relatively less strong set of 3 ties that are embedded in a triple. And so the power comes in the fact that there's a group. It's more of a sociological story, and that was Zimmel's story. There's a group, and the group can in fact takes precedence over our individual choices about the interactions we have in those ties. So those are the major themes of partly what I talked about and partly where I'm coming from with this set of Simmelian tie sets of research and stories. So I'm certainly open to questions. And if you raise a hand and I don't see it, Nikita, help me. And but by all means, please feel free to open up your mic and ask any questions.
Yeah, thank you, David. Yes, you can either virtually raise hand or just unmute yourself and speak up.
Okay. If I may ask a question, if you talk about triple embedded, let's say ties, links, as contrasted with those which are not, what is the typical character of these triple embedded relationships? Can you say anything positive about this? Are these friendly, competitive relationships? Are these actually intrinsically symmetrical or asymmetrical? Or is it that you can actually infer nothing about them, that they just exist? And the triangle is a geometrically fixed structure. This is very well known. Therefore, it's fortified by its very geometry. But can you say something more? I mean, when you talked about asymmetrical relationships, you talked about hierarchies, dominance and submission. And is a triangle a more egalitarian structure intrinsically or not? Can you say this? Is it more a horizontal network, decentralized, so to speak, the beginning of the decentralization process? If you continue not just a triangle, but a set of triangles, so forth. So could you please answer this question? Thank you.
Sure. Okay, that's a good question. And first of all, let me say that Simmel certainly talks about certain levels of hierarchy that can emerge. But in the definition that I've used, that I've inferred from his work and from the work I've done, is I've decided that the asymmetric nature of a tie is itself important information. And so I have, by definition, excluded asymmetric ties from a Simmelian tie. So if a tie is asymmetric, that is, if I send a tie to you and you don't send one back to me, so therefore it's asymmetric, then there, by definition, you and I are not Simmelian tied, even if we have a lot of ties in common. So if you have a lot of asymmetric ties pointing to one person, and they are all well connected to each other, none of those ties to that one person who might be at some particular high status in the organization, those are not Simmelian ties. It's not that Simmelian ties necessarily induce equality in the system. That's not true. I would not infer that. As a matter of fact, if you are a member of two triangles and you are at the center of a butterfly, let's say, then you are Simmelian tied to, I call that a bow tie structure. You are Simmelian tied to all four other people, but you occupy a special position. You are, in fact, a Simmelian broker. So, in fact, you have even more, perhaps, power in that position, but you also have more constraint, because what's special about a Simmelian tie is it entails you in a group. And as soon as it entails you in a group, that reduces your freedom. So while it does induce cooperation, it does induce collaboration, or at least it tends to coincide with lots of collaborative effort that is controlled by the group. The group has its own set of norms. If you become at the intersection of two of those groups so that you are a Simmelian broker, then what happens is you now have to obey two different masters. And in fact, that can actually be in a worse position, in the sense that you've got two sets of rules you have to obey. And if your behavior is public, then if you're violating one rule from this group, even though it's perfectly fine with this group, you can still get in trouble. And so that becomes actually a point of constraint, which is one of the points where I differ with Ron. Ron would say, you know, that's an example of very strong position, being a broker in between two groups. And I'd say, yeah, that's true if they're not Simmelian tied. If you've got free floating ties, then that puts you in a very strong position. But if you are embedded in multiple groups who have very different norms and your behavior is public, then in fact, that induces more restraints and constraints on you than perhaps even if you were just part of one group where you only had one group set of norms you had to worry about. So there are all these different implications. I'll say the major point I'd like to bring home, though, is not that there's equality, but that there is a sense of group identity. That a Simmelian tie means that you are part of a group, that there isn't any inherent status in that group, and that what that does, though, what you give up in being part of that group is some of the freedom you might enjoy if you were, if your ties were not so embedded. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
I think it does, certainly. Thank you very much.
yes. Stepan.
So,
Hi, David. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question which is related to the previous one, because I found that Simmelian ties were usually mentioned in the context of networks collected based on the dyadic relations, but there are also networks collected based on non-dyadic relations where, for example, students are asked who they think belongs to which group, so-called social cognitive maps.
Yes.
And in this context, do you think that Simmelian ties are also applicable, or these ties within such groups represent different nature and are stronger or weaker? Because I can also see some examples of closed triads where people interact or have relations only in pairs, but are not really interacting all together.
Yes. Okay, so I hear a couple questions in there. One is, if I understood you right, you have persons and group identities. So you have a two-mode network, persons and groups, duality of persons, that kind of issue. And then what we often do is we take a two-mode network like that and multiply it times the transpose. So we get a person-by-person network where a tie means you have some element in common, common group or common event or co-citation or something like that. I have not pursued that kind of, I don't think that is a good example of an application of the theory of Simmelian ties, and I'll tell you why. I mean, it's not, certainly Simmelian ties might occur in that context, but the problem is this. Whenever you induce a network that way, you almost by definition create Simmelian ties. As soon as you have three people who are, are three articles cited by one article, or you have three people, members of a group, those are not three independent ties that coalesce and form as a group, a Simmelian tie. Those are kind of Simmelian by construction. So for me, my thinking is that the underlying Simmelian theory of voluntary, positive, strong interactions that coalesce into a mutual triad, that doesn't really apply in that case, because you are artificially inducing the presence of Simmelian triads through the way you collect the data. So I haven't pursued that application there, but I will say something else about that you bring to mind. I learn a lot from my students. I'll be honest about that. Sometimes they're a lot smarter than me, and they're not as narrow. They're very much they don't take seriously everything I say. So everything I just told you says that what's really important about a Simmelian tie is that each of the dyads is face to face. It has a positive affect, and it's mutual, and then it's embedded. And you got to have three of those embedded in a group in order for you to have a Simmelian tie. And my student was an MIS kind of guy, and he says, I've got this listserv data, and I'm willing to bet that people develop dyadic Simmelian listserv relationships. That is, they answer each other's questions on the listserv without even seeing each other. And I'm willing to bet Simmelian ties work there. That is, induce cooperative behavior and develop a sort of group set of norms and so on. And I said, no, they don't. Because the Simmel theory is very clearly dyadic, face-to-face. You got to be together, and we can't form Simmelian ties by having transactions where we're in this transaction, especially over a computer. It's just impossible. And this was a listserv, so we didn't even get to see people's faces. It was just somebody posing a question. This was a corporate listserv. Somebody poses a question. Somebody else thousands of miles away could answer the question, and they had the whole data set. And it turns out I was wrong. He said, let me try it. And what he did is he showed that if you look at the behaviors over a 3-month burn-in period and look at how people develop a habit of answering each other's questions, and they do so mutually, as soon as they get a triad of listserv connections that happen over different issues, different times, it's not even clear that all three are aware of each other as far as I can tell. But if you get three of them that do it together, all of a sudden at time 2, it induces a cooperation. They're much more willing to help each other out later on than other kinds of structural features that those ties are embedded in. It's as if Simmelian ties actually form, Simmelian groups actually form in computer space too, where there isn't a simultaneous all three people being together and interacting with each other. So I am willing to learn. I am willing to say that, in fact, I I don't know everything there is about these Simmelian ties. He has not published that yet. I'm encouraging him to do that, but those results help me to stay a little bit humble about where Simmelian ties are appropriate and where they're theoretically at least not as appropriate.
Thank you for such a long and interesting answer.
Aleksandra.
Yeah, hello, David. Nice to meet you virtually. Actually, I would like to ask a question which follows the two first ones. Maybe you will get tired of these questions, but still, if you are tired, just tell me, just don't answer. Yeah, but I was wondering, and you told this beautiful example about the listserv. So I was wondering, maybe in your practice, have you met the cases when the so-called semantic similarity is also important for formation of Simmelian ties? For example, people not only going to one bookshop, but also reading the same book or books, or maybe writing on a similar topic and reading the same, quoting the same authors and writing papers on the same topic. So it will be really interesting to learn about this kind of cases with semantic similarities.
Right. Certainly, there are a lot of opportunities to study that now that there weren't 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So Kathleen Carley has been looking at that. She's a colleague of mine here at CMU, and she's been looking at a lot how text similarity in documents and so on induces a sort of cooperative behavior. My view on that, what I've done on that is, well, first of all, I'm still stuck in this idea, this Simmelian, Simmel's stories themselves are very social stories. They're not really informational. And I think that text similarity does not necessarily induce a social bond. And I think of again, I could be wrong. The listserv thing certainly proved me wrong. But the theory that undergirds at least my Simmelian thinking is that these are social bonds that become embedded in a group, and when that happens, they magically transform into this thing. But on the other hand, let me tell you, let me flip it around and say one thing I do say, and excuse my dog, quiet. Sorry about that. He and I are both quarantined in the same place, so. One thing I have done is pursued again with another student the idea that Simmelian, rather than saying that common understanding and common language induces Simmelian ties, rather that once you are in a group, one of the outcomes of being in that group is you develop a common language and common understanding, and that has an impact. So one of the things we did find is that when you had a Simmelian tie to a researcher in another part of the world, if you are embedded in a Simmelian tie, a Simmelian triple, working with that person, what that does is induce common language, common understanding, and greatly facilitate innovative, boundary-spanning kind of work and research. Now, this was done in a firm, not in an academic institute, an R&D firm, and we use that common language explanation for how it is, because when you become Simmelian tie, you develop a common understanding, common language, a shortcut for words and for understanding concepts and difficult concepts. And by doing that over time, what that does is facilitate any innovation, which is exacerbated by the fact that these ties stretch over very large physical boundaries. So it's a way of getting, our argument is it's a way of getting both the boundary spanning advantages of having ties that stretch across those boundaries and pick up new information across those boundaries, and at the same time having the common language understanding that facilitates being able to integrate those into a new idea and develop a natural product. And we found that those structures, in fact, greatly facilitated the ability of these R&D employees, researchers in this big R&D firm. It greatly enhanced their ability to produce innovative products, to produce patents, and so on. So it had that kind of outcome. But I used the common language as an explanation for it, rather than a mechanism for inducing a Simmelian tie.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yes.
By the way, that last that study was with Marco Tortoriello, who's at Bocconi, so he's a great example of somebody I'm Simmelian tied to and still do work with, together with some other colleagues. And we do great innovative stuff because we're stretched across whole oceans.
Okay, may I pick up where you have just left off, so to speak? Actually, a triangle is a kind of a magic object which may improve relations. Imagine me having two friends which hate each other. But if a triangle forms, their relationship by necessity improves. And maybe it's not very far-fetched to say that for political coalitions between political leaders, they follow exactly the same principle, tend to form triangles, like in the Second World War, Germany, Italy, and Japan, a triangle. The First World War, the three Central Powers, you remember?
Yes.
This makes sense.
Well, I don't remember personally, but yes, I know the history you're talking about. Yes, you're absolutely right. I would say that coalitions often form over common interests like that, and that's a little bit, and they do, and clearly lots of relationships are not positive. I would argue that Simmel and I were talking only about positive ties as a bedrock. So I would not anticipate that any triple relationship that's even strong, if those are negative ties, those do not, in my view, constitute a part of the Simmelian tie story. So I would exclude those kinds of relationships. One thing though that's clearly true, and I think this is better explained by balance theory, frankly, than Simmelian tie theory, and that is coalitions realign as soon as they get threatened by somebody. So that an outside, outside threat comes to mind. Like, for example, UK and Russia were not exactly friends before World War II, and at all. And then, but World War II forced them, I think, because of the common threat of Germany, forced them or induced them to form a very strong tie. But I would explain that not from a Simmelian story. I would explain that particular formation. I would explain that with balance theory. I think, a common friend of a friend is a friend, and an enemy of an enemy is a friend. That kind of argument is probably, when you're dealing with sign graphs, that's probably a better mechanism for explanation than Simmelian ties.
Okay.
I'll also add with that, though, that balance theory, it turns out, does not explain as much going forward in positive situations as we thought. One of the papers I did on this looked at the formation and stability of ties in the Newcomb data, which, this is the same data that I presented. And what we did was we looked at whether balance theory was a better predictor. Balance theory is always used to predict the formation of ties and so on, and the stability of ties. And what we found was that the Simmelian balance theory was a better predictor in the first couple weeks when people didn't know each other. Balance was used to sort of form ties. But then after several weeks, Simmelian ties took over. What happened was once people got solidified into a group, that was the source of stability rather than balance itself. So I know you didn't ask about that, but I thought I'd throw that in there.
Thank you very much. Yes.
I actually think that this distinction that you referred to between the Simmelian ties and the triangles is important. And maybe also for the listserv study you mentioned. Because, well, for Simmel, I think the three are to be aware of each other's behaviors and attitudes, and that's why eco-presence is so important. So I'm not sure whether in listserv relations, the dyad that is embedded in a triad, both of them are equally aware or more or less aware of each of their relationships with the third person.
Right. And so I would say that's a Simmelian process. That's part of the Simmelian process. Matter of fact, Simmel was very explicit in his argument that said one of the reasons that being in a triple like this is so powerful is that if two people in that triple have an argument, a disagreement, then even the presence, the fact that there's a third party there who's not part of the disagreement, that the presence of that third party who both people trust and is part of the group, the presence of that third party gets the two people in conflict to, it ameliorates the conflict, it reduces the intensity so it doesn't spiral out of control. People temper their reactions. They moderate themselves simply because of the presence of the third other, even though the third person is not engaged in that dyadic conflict. That's part of the Simmelian story. I'm not sure what. I'm not sure if that relates to what you're talking about, Nikita, or not.
I think it makes a major difference for the listserv or other types of virtual relationships when not the ones we have here, when we all observe each other's interactions,
right?
But rather the dyadic ones,
when they're isolated, when there are a series of isolated like the listserv. The listserv is a good example of that.
The interaction events are isolated dyadic. Yeah.
Yes. When the that's a good point. And my argument would be that my argument would have been, before he told me I was wrong, my argument would have been, no, that's not a Simmelian process. That's not what Simmel was talking about. Those are not Simmelian ties. Simmelian ties happen when three people end up, because of their relationships, being co-present, and they start identifying as being, we're a group, we're a club, we're a micro group, and we're all friends with each other, and that counts for something. And when they all mutually recognize that. And that wasn't at all clear to me that that was going to happen in the listserv. So I would argue, theoretically anyway, I would argue that isolated, even strong, isolated dyadic examples between three pairs of people that would form a triangle if you measured just the interactions themselves, but they're all in isolation and unaware of the other interactions. I have a hard time putting that within the Simmelian theoretical story. And if people want to empirically prove me wrong, I'm happy when they do that, but I don't have a good story for why that happens. I can tell you what my student says. My student says, you know what? People are observing people answering each other's questions. And they do get a sense of that. They do develop a consciousness of that. So his argument is people are aware of it. It is public. And so when all it is, you post a question, somebody answers it, but people see that. And so he argues there is a consciousness of it. I guess if I were to take your example though and say, what if they really aren't aware of each other's interactions? I'd argue that that's not, and I would argue theoretically that's not part of the Simmelian tie story.
Yeah. I guess if we can be sure that the interaction is always observable,
yeah,
then it definitely should work. I mean, the Simmelian tie.
Right.
But if we're not sure, and it's not always that, we're not always sure, because sometimes, like in SOCNet, we sometimes respond personally, and the others don't see that and are not aware of these.
No, that's right, and that's a good observation, and I would argue that's a boundary condition around Simmelian ties, that it only operates when people have opportunities to mutually observe these interactions, that they're not hidden, or that people are unaware of some other interactions. I do have some evidence for that, in that I find that when people are Simmelian tied in organizations, they have a much better understanding of the relationships that occur among the people that they're Simmelian tied to. So there's an accuracy question from the cognitive social structure perspective, and that if people are Simmelian tied, they do have a better understanding of both their relationships within the whole organization. That is, they have a more accurate perception of what the other person's set of relationships are than if they're simply tied. If they're simply tied to each other, that understanding isn't as, the mutual understanding is not as strong. So, I think that is part of the, I would call it the boundary condition of Simmelian tie theory, that it's a necessary condition.
Yeah, it really connects to the cognitive social structure studies.
Yes. Yes, and that's a paper I did with Martin Kilduff in Social Networks some time ago about culture, and how Simmelian ties actually allow us to embed and understand cultural understandings, because part of our culture is understanding who's related to who. That's actually an important part of our cultural understanding. So that's how I put that all together.
Absolutely. Yeah. And not even for Simmelian ties, actually, but also for the balance, for instance. You have to have this awareness. Otherwise, these processes just don't work. And they are sometimes assumed in the structures where people are not aware of others' interactions, while they can't be present there, these mechanisms.
Yeah, you bring up a very interesting point, and let me just say that psychology, which the field of psychology, which is where Heider came from, really emphasizes that it's not a question of having balance in terms of, like what we in network analysis, we always say triads are balanced if they're transitive and symmetric, then they're balanced, and Heider is wonderful. When in fact, Heider didn't say that at all. Heider was very much about perceptions. That is, I, as the actor, have to perceive that this person and I like the same third other person or object. And that's very much of a perceptual thing, not a reality thing. And you're right that I think frankly, in network terms, we have forgotten that. We've completely left that out of our, when we reference balance, we very seldom talk about, well, it's maybe balanced from the individual's point of view because this is how they perceive it. And I will say though, that people that have looked at that and cognitive balance in the cognitive social structures don't find a lot of exceptions to balanced triples in our cognitive social structures, that is in our perceptions. So it's not, I wouldn't say balance theory is the idea of cognitive social structures and understanding balance from that perspective is not necessarily going to solve this problem. Also, I'll add one more thing about balance. I'm actually interested in balance. I've written on this too. one of the things about balance is balance theory really stems from a signed network, not from a positive tie only network. Balance only occurs as we were talking about before, with like you have an enemy, you have somebody who you have a negative tie to, then somebody else has a negative tie to them and you have a positive tie to that person. So the mutual negative tie is what induces balance. Heider is very specific about that. It's positive and negative ties. It's not the non-existence or not neutral tie. Neutral ties is part of the story. So, and we very, very seldom have enough rich data to be able to test, really test balance theory in a network from that signed graph perspective. Doesn't keep, but Simmelian ties, we can go to town with that because that's all about positive ties, and that allows us to study a lot of phenomena that we don't have to worry about Heider as much. I'm not sure that answered your question, did it?
Do we have any? Are you asking me? Because you're here, Stan, who you are addressing? Oh, I think we have a new question here. Let's maybe.
Yeah, if I may. Well, thank you so much for the whole report that we were pleased to hear. I would like to ask a question. For instance, if we have some network, for instance, a network of classmates or network of employees, and for instance, in order to solidify, can we form the triangles inside of this organization in order to solidify, or this is not as simple as it seems to be, and those triads are needed to be formed more naturally?
Are you asking me if I think we can induce triangles in order to make a place better? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, well, practically yes. For instance, when there are no some triads, and we can just induce them, and this will promote and cause solidification with
make a better world. Yeah. Everybody's Simmelian tied to everybody else, and the world would be a better place.
With some organizations and etc.
Yeah, or the organization would be a better place. Okay, I have two responses to that. The first is that that just inducing Simmelian ties, or making the corporation, for example, or an organization, fully embedded, so that everybody's embedded with everybody else, is not feasible. It's not feasible, and it's not even desirable. And part of the reason for that is in another paper I wrote called "The Ties That Torture," and that's a case where what happened was the creativity is really inhibited by these Simmelian ties if they become too imploded. So people become constrained, and if you have everybody Simmelian tied to everybody else, then all of a sudden there's no, it's very difficult to change that system. It becomes kind of reified into a blob that becomes where innovation is very difficult. So it's not clear to me that you want everybody Simmelian tied to. You don't want a world that's nothing but Simmelian ties. I think you can go too far. But on the other hand, there's certainly some advantages. If you could have a group that that you need the cooperation, you need the common understanding. In the R&D case I was telling you about, you need some Simmelian ties bridging across those labs that are cutting across the globe. Those were very healthy. So the question is not, do I get more or do I have less? The question is, where do I strategically place them so that it will do some good? I think that's a very important question that we haven't focused enough on. The second part of your question, though, my second reaction to the question is, you cannot order people to be Simmelian tied. You can't just say, okay, you three are now Simmelian tied. You can't order people to be friends. Social ties emerge. They develop. I mean, that was one of my real important messages in the Philos paper when I was writing that was, there's no such thing as instant friends. You don't just all of a sudden make friends. What you do is you develop friends over time. It takes time to do those things. I think Simmelian ties also take time. They don't just magically appear. And you, as an authority holder in the organization, cannot force Simmelian ties. You can encourage them. You can increase the probability of Simmelian ties through co-presence. I think one of our big inducers, one of our big handles that we get to use in organizations is by using the law of propinquity, where, you know, putting people closer together induces a higher probability they'll form a tie, they'll form a social tie, a bond. It won't guarantee it, but you can induce higher probability. If you coalesce people together into physical proximity, you'll increase the probability of ties forming. Davis, when he was looking at the early work of transitivity, was saying balance. That was his. He was a sociologist, and he said he noticed that the reason networks become transitive is not because balance theory, not because I like you, you like somebody else, and therefore I'm going to like somebody else. He says that's not what does it. He says, if I like you, you and I are friends, we're going to hang out together. If that person likes that person, they're going to hang out together. And if the three of us are sort of hanging out together, eventually over time, we're likely to hang out with a third person, and so we will induce a relationship. Physical proximity is probably one of our strongest levers for being able to influence relationships. So that's my general answer.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
So do we have any other questions right away?
Perhaps one last remark or a question. It's a delicate topic I am touching on. Love triangles sometimes are quite stable, contrary to common prejudice. They sometimes exist, have a lot of longevity, as exemplified by the story with the Russian poet Mayakovsky, whose lover was married to another man. And maybe this again indirectly lends support to your idea of the magic healing power of the triangle structure. Okay, would you agree at this point with me?
I am certainly willing to consider that might operate. I think that's very dangerous territory. I'm not sure what you want to do is induce people having love affairs with other people's spouses in order to induce some kind of
very subversive idea indeed.
It's an intriguing idea, but that one might be fraught with some problems.
But it seems to be a consequence, a kind of corollary in terms of your theory.
Again, yeah. There probably are some boundary conditions for the theory, and I worry about extramarital affairs as being one's ways of inducing. As a matter of fact, if anything, I would say that's a tertius godens. You get a woman who's got two lovers, one of them happens to be her husband. That is not necessarily going to induce a positive tie between the two men. That would be my guess.
This will be physical proximity.
It could induce some proximity. If I were her, I would make sure that that proximity did not happen very often. That's what I would.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, but that would definitely induce a lot of stress, referring to your other paper.
Oh, yeah.
Create a stress.
Create a stress.
Yes.
But I think that there are also counterexamples of polyamorous relationships where all parties agree upon these relations and they also can have relations with each other. And there are couples of 3 or more people participating in such relationships.
Yeah. There are sections of Utah where that happens a lot by religious law.
Yeah, but that refers actually again to this stress issue. So since Simmel says this is like the micropolitics, the simplest micropolitical structure, and we know it also to probably be perhaps the simplest social structure, at least as far as Carter is concerned. So might it be that these structures are not that positive as we tend to think about them, but actually not only communicate stress well, as you show in your paper, but also to be stress-inducing or stress-producing, because with these micropolitics, when we have to struggle, like not only in love relationships, but also in triples of friends, when persons, so if we have this diet, a Simmelian diet embedded in a triangle, they may also start to struggle for the attention of this third person, or this third person starts to interfere. You know, all these micropolitics that starts to happen in these relationships may grow into something different. Have you thought about this, or did you do any research on it?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of ideas that you came up with. I mean, one of the reasons that I was interested in this stress study that my student was conducting was to look at that, to see if in fact Simmelian ties might be another part of the stress contagion story. And let me say that the problem is there are lots of complications in those dynamics. I mean, what if, I mean, think about, in any triple, they might have 3 different levels of stress, and they may have any of 16 different configurations of relationships, only one of which would be Simmelian. But each of which would induce, because of the combinations of stress and so on, with each of those different kinds of triples, would induce a different kind of dynamic. We have tried to look at that, and in the data that we have that I shared with you, we have not been very successful because the data get too thin too quickly. So I don't have a good empirical answer to that, because you need so many observations over time to see how these dynamics evolve. So many, because there are just too many configurations, too many combinations so we don't have a good handle on that yet. As a matter of fact, I think I might have mentioned in my talk that we had a fourth data set, a 4th time period, which I didn't include because by the time for the 4th one, the number of Simmelian triples, basically using the strict definition of a Philos tie and a Simmelian tie, they all disappeared. There just weren't any. There weren't any by the time So I only used the first 3 because even there, the number of observations diminishes because of the restriction I'm putting on in terms of I'm looking at Simmelian triples, which is a strong definition, and only looking at it when it's comparing it when they're preserved over time. That you run out of observations very quickly. So I think it's we have thought about it. We have not had any luck exploring that avenue on these data. My student is doing something very different with I was going to say Nikita, with Nenko, who's an expert in dynamic Siena models and looking at stochastic actor-oriented models. That's turned out to be a much better way of thinking about it, but we don't have a Simmelian parameter in there yet, because that's actually turns out to be another difficulty, is actually creating a parameter in these complicated exponential family models is just something we haven't done yet. That's going to require some programming. You asked a hard question, Nikita.
That's my job. Yeah, but thank you. It's really great to know how these things develop, and yeah, it will be most interesting to see the models and where they take us. I guess that time-wise, we are more or less expected to wrap up. So unless we have any other burning questions, maybe we could postpone the rest for the next meeting, which hopefully we can do in person. Yeah, but so far so long. Let us thank David for this, I think, amazing talk and the discussion, which was great as well. I think it works really well.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed it. The great questions, getting me to think more and more about how I might go in the future on this work too. So.
Yeah. So thanks again. Thanks everyone for attending.
Okay.
And see you all tomorrow at the sessions. We don't have a keynote discussion, but we still have the session. So thanks a lot. Have a nice evening, morning, or whatever you have right now. Yeah. So, and yeah, see you tomorrow.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.